I would not want to be a car owner in Russia right now. In normal times, the Kremlin subsidizes domestic fuel prices by paying oil companies to not export fuel on the more lucrative international market. This fuel damper can cost the Kremlin tens of billions of dollars each year. However, with Ukraine setting refinery after refinery ablaze, domestic supplies are dwindling, and Russians, who are used to paying below-market prices for their fuel, are now struggling to find reliable supplies of a basic commodity. In turn, the Kremlin is increasingly concerned that domestic strife might disrupt plans to continue fighting the war in Ukraine. Now, we may be a long way from Putin is done, but we should at least get a better understanding of the overall strategy here. Indeed, there are a lot of things about autocracies that seem absolutely bizarre from the outside. But energy subsidies might top the list. Russia is not alone here. They are common in energy-rich autocracies. Sometimes they cover petrol, as in the Russian example, but you will often see them for electricity and natural gas as well. And they seem kind of normal at first, but then they just get weirder and weirder the deeper that you dive into them. And understanding why these countries implement the offending policy reveals just how messed up autocratic systems are, and why democracies tend to outcompete them. In fact, you might recall that I recently referenced energy subsidies when discussing China and Russia's inability to sign a pipeline agreement, and how Beijing is specifically trying to negotiate for prices equivalent to the subsidized domestic rate that Russian consumers pay. I said that domestically subsidized prices are ridiculous, and I meant it. They hurt the citizens in those countries, they hurt the governments that are paying them, and heck, they even somehow hurt those of us living in democracies who are not a part of the scheme at all. And if you stick with me to the end, we will see why this raises a significant problem for Vladimir Putin in managing the domestic side of the war effort. Let's zoom out for a second. Just because a policy is absurd does not mean that the reason that someone implemented it is stupid. In fact, we can still explain what is happening here as social scientists. At first pass, these subsidies look like a rare win for citizens living under autocratic rule. Their governments engage in all sorts of repressive and extractive policies elsewhere. At least this is the one bright spot that they have. Heck, if you are familiar with the resource curse, it almost feels poetic. Countries with vast natural resources tend to have worse governing systems. Resourceless governments have to treat their populations with some level of respect if they hope to ever raise tax revenue from them. In contrast, resource-rich governments know that they will always have funds available by licensing and selling gold, gas, or whatever else. So they never bother to create good institutions because they do not need the cooperation of their populations. Again, at least the subsidized price is giving something back to those citizens. But that ought to raise the first red flag. Extractive governments like to extract. Why aren't they extracting here too? It must not be a matter of pure generosity. And even if this does not rise to the level of sinister, then whatever is happening still must be at least coercive. And then when you start to think about the core economics of any subsidy, things really start to go haywire. Imagine that the global market price for a liter of gasoline is $1, and that is what our citizens currently pay. But then our autocratic government, overflowing in oil, wants to demonstrate its generosity to the people by selling a liter at 50 cents instead. If everyone continued to consume gasoline at the same rate as before, this would be no big deal. The government would be paying half of the price, which would ultimately be a cash transfer from the government to the people. Sure, you might raise some distributional complaints about the matter. The primary beneficiaries are people who own cars, for example, but that is a political dispute that you can have amongst yourselves. Unfortunately, there is a perverse second factor in play. The people will not continue their gasoline consumption in the same way. Previously, they were consuming gasoline until their marginal gain from a liter equaled $1. When the price for them drops to 50 cents, they will collectively ramp up consumption until each of their marginal gains from a liter drops to that same 50-cent marker. Let me give you a few examples of the ridiculous things that can result from these subsidies. How about Venezuela, where the government set electricity prices at around 50 times less than comparable Latin American countries? With the bolivar undergoing hyperinflation, there was great demand for hard currency that could retain its value. So what would you do in this situation? If you said, exploit the virtually free electricity to mine Bitcoin, then congratulations, you're a winner. Your prize? Blackouts across the country, because the grid cannot handle the load. Or how about Iran, where you can get gasoline for as cheap as 3 cents per liter? Many of you will not find use for the quantity that you can buy at that price, never mind the further liters that you could purchase at a still heavily subsidized rate. Might I suggest loading some onto a small boat to smuggle across the Gulf, where you can sell your gasoline at a price closer to the global market rate? By the way, this is one of the problems that will arise when trying to escort tankers through the Strait of Hormuz. You want to fire against small boats that could be threatening a tanker, but you do not want to kill an average Iranian just trying to smuggle oil out of the country. As a final example, how about Turkmenistan prior to 2019? Free natural gas for everyone. Great, but it gave rise to the saying, a Turkmen does not turn off his stove, because then he will have to pay for matches. Hence why I had to add the prior to 2019 qualifier there, because that policy sure as heck was not sustainable. The commonality across all of these examples, and any attempt to implement a subsidy for that matter, is that subsidies lead to something economists call deadweight loss. The black market gasoline case is the easiest way to illustrate the problem. Let's imagine that the government gives you a quota of 10 liters of gasoline per month at a subsidized price of $0.00. You only really need to use 6, leaving you with 4 spare liters. Well, you know a guy who calls himself Black Market Bob. You will purchase your spare liters for 50 cents each, with plans to try to sell the oil in a neighboring country at great personal risk. So you swing those excess liters over and pocket $2. Not a bad month as far as you are concerned. However, look at this from the government's perspective. It gave you 10 liters of gasoline for free. But what if it ended all subsidies and sold those liters at the market price of $1 to all buyers, foreign and domestic? Had it done so, it could have brought in $10 in revenue. Of course, this new policy might upset you because the government is stealing from the people's reserves. So, to quell a revolution, the government just hands you $9 as your share. Okay, how should you feel about that? Pretty good, as it turns out. You can still buy gasoline on the open market for $1 per liter. You needed those initial 6 liters of gas, so you pay $6 to buy them. But you stop thereafter with $3 still left over. In total, before you finished with 6 liters of gas and $1. After, you finish with 6 liters of gas and $3. I don't know about you, but option 2 sounds better to me. Meanwhile, the government is happy with the arrangement as well. Either way, it was parting with 10 liters of gas. Before, it had nothing to show for it. Now it retains $1. Using a black market as an example makes the issue mind-numbingly obvious. But all of these government subsidies create perverse incentives in other ways. And at the end of the day, consumers who do not internalize the full cost of an item will consume past the point of economic efficiency. As a result, there will always be more money to spread around to everyone without the subsidies than with the subsidies. Now, in practice, distributing the money to ensure that literally everyone ends up better off without the subsidy is impractical. For example, Black Market Bob might not be square by the end of it, but these people are few and far between. The vast majority of average consumers would be richer if they just received cash subsidies instead. And if they really wanted to buy fuel, they could just buy fuel at the same price as anyone else in the world, perhaps using the money from the government payment to afford it. And by the way, this should frustrate you too, even if you live in a country with no subsidies like that. Every country that subsidizes electricity, petrol, or natural gas artificially inflates demand for those commodities. For example, all of that gas left on in Turkmenistan was implicitly constricting supply elsewhere in the world. That means everyone else, no matter where they live, ends up paying for a portion of the subsidy in the form of higher prices. Personal rage aside, we are still left with the question of why autocratic systems tend to run that way. Well, to be honest, some of it is that your average person might not even realize that the system is bad. That might also explain why some democracies end up with these kinds of subsidies anyway. But not all do, and some go in quite the opposite direction. So let's just stick to the tendency and not get clever by citing misrepresentative counterexamples. I can give you two explanations for why autocrats engage in this sort of behavior, and both are predicated on trust, or lack thereof. For one, how does a citizen know that he is getting his fair share of the country's energy receipts? It is very easy for an autocratic government to say, "Geez, it was a rough year for our oil wells, and we had to reinvest heavily in infrastructure this year to prepare for future challenges. So, sorry, but there is no profit sharing this time around." Such deception does not work in a democratic system, because heavily regulated agencies oversee the operations, and there is no one sitting at the top of the government that could easily capture all of the hidden profits, even if there was money for the taking. The second bit is that this is one of the few ways that autocratic governments can make something close to a credible commitment. We have discussed a dozen times how citizens are at a disadvantage when it comes to resisting the government. If too few try to protest, they just get disappeared. To properly strike fear in the government, citizens need to coordinate so that they have safety in numbers. By and large, governments go to great lengths to try to suppress coordination. Think about the Great Firewall of China as an example. However, there are times when autocrats want to make concessions to their citizens to quell what could become an uprising. The classic problem is that once tensions have died down, the autocrat usually has all the incentive to renege on those concessions. Well, imagine the autocrat lowered gasoline prices. What happens if he tries to renege afterward? Literal signs will change as a result. It is not just the fact that he reneged on the matter. It is the fact that everyone else sees it at the same time, and even more importantly, everyone knows that everyone else is seeing it at the same time. The signs might as well scream, "Everyone is protesting at the town square today. Come join!" Autocrats really hate encouraging that coordination, and thus it is a very dangerous idea to backtrack on the deal. And, in turn, everyone is okay living with a little bit of inefficiency from a subsidy to avoid the much greater inefficiency of a civil war. This is not a hypothetical either. Sometimes government budgets and domestic supply go haywire. Any reasonable economist would suggest that serious changes are necessary for the financial stability of the country. And, almost without fail, any deviation from the subsidy is met with significant domestic instability. In a year full of concerns for Vladimir Putin, this is another one to add to the list. For decades, Russians have planned their daily lives around subsidized fuel prices, expecting there to be an abundant supply. Ukraine's refinery strikes are throttling Russian petrol production, causing significant upheaval for domestic consumers. An objective economist would look at the situation and say that the policy needs to change. But the Kremlin cannot change it without breaking what average Russian citizens view as a part of their social contract. And again, more importantly, breaking it will also make everyone aware that everyone else is aware that the contract has been broken. Thus, we are stuck in the current state of tension. So, overall, the next time that you hear about an autocrat offering an energy subsidy, do not think that it is out of generosity. Think that it is out of lack of trustworthiness. And that is a problem for the Kremlin at the moment. Meanwhile, you can trust me with the evergreen knowledge drops by checking out this playlist. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe. And I will see you next time. Take care.